Hi, everybody. This is Joan Tabachnik, and I want to welcome you to the webinar today, Supporting Families of Children and Adolescents with Problematic Sexual Behaviors, presented by Jane Silevsky and Jimmy Whitfield. I hope I got that right, Jane. I'm really excited about this particular topic because there's really not enough information here. And before I turn this over to Jane and Jimmy, I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about NERI Press. And the mission of NERI Press is really to share with you the cutting edge information and research that we see out in the field. Traditionally, we've done that with books, but more recently, we're doing that with our free newsletter. We're doing that with online courses, as well as face-to-face trainings, and most recently with these NERI Press webinars. And so basically, I just want to, we'll talk a little more at the end, but I just want to say we could not do these webinars if we did not have sponsors from people and organizations like you listening to this today. If you do want to become a sponsor, there'll be information at the end of the webinar, but we offer, sort of like NPR, we offer you a free gift of our books when you join. And we also guarantee you a seat at each of our webinars, and also that let you know that that each of these are possible only because of you and your support. I also want to go through a little bit of housekeeping and say that, like every other workshop, we have learning objectives. And the learning objectives for today are to offer you research-based knowledge on problematic sexual behaviors in children and illegal sexual behaviors in adolescents. We want to talk about evidence that counters common misconceptions about children with problematic sexual behavior and adolescents with illegal sexual behaviors. And last, to identify the research-supported components of treatment for youth with sexual behavior problems. We also wanted to say that this particular PowerPoint will be, and actually is now right now on the NERI Press website. So please, if you want to download these slides, we'll also be posting a recording of this on the NERI Press website as well. And at the very end, if you could close out your account, because that allows us to then send you an evaluation, and we really appreciate your feedback for all of these. And last, to say that there are continuing education credits available. And if you go to our website, you can find out more about that as well. Last, I just want to take those two books here that are available. The first is Jane's book, and another one from Barbara Bonner talking about taking action. And both of these books really address when a parent learns that his or her children has been sexually abused by a child or is displaying serious sexual behavior problems. The discovery often causes uncertainty and confusion and pain. Yet this is precisely when the child needs help. And these books really provide that kind of information and background and are available through NERI Press as well. Now it's really my great pleasure to introduce Jane and Jimmy. For those who don't know them, Jane is a clinical child psychologist and the Associate Director of the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. She's currently a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center and is also Director of the Treatment Program for Children with Problematic Sexual Behavior. Jimmy is a licensed professional counselor at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center. He's also works at the Center on Child Abuse and Neglect in Oklahoma City, and he's also co-director of the treatment program for children with problematic sexual behaviors with school-age children. And without further ado, I actually would like to turn this over to Jane and to Jimmy, and welcome. It's really a total pleasure to have you here today.
Great. Well, hello and welcome. I'm going to try to get some things set up. Wonderful. It is an honor to be here to do this webinar today. My name is Jimmy Whitfield Jr. Of course, I'm co-presenting today with Jane Silevsky, and we're very excited. We have a lot of information to cover and a little bit of amount of time to do that, so we'll jump right on in. Hopefully you're in the right place. We're going to be talking about kids and sex today with a little bit of a different slant, and we'll talk more about that in a slide or two. We do need to acknowledge quickly that part of what makes it possible for Jane and I to do this webinar today is funding that we receive through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, a federal office that allows us to provide training and technical assistance throughout the United States. So a quick nod to OJJDP and their contribution. Joan has already covered the presentation objectives for today, and really I think Jane and I hope most of all, that you learn a little something about kids and teenagers that have had problematic or illegal sexual behavior that will help you go back into your communities and create some positive change for these children, their victims, and their families. Often these kids are siloed out or aren't receiving the right kind of treatment or the right kind of management in child welfare or juvenile justice. So hopefully today you'll get something out of this that you can take back regardless of your discipline and your role in the community and help these children and their families. We'll start today by talking a little bit about what's typical sexual behavior. And that's important information to have first so that when we talk about problematic sexual behavior, you have a foundation for what's normal versus not. So normal sexual behavior, of course, are behaviors between children and teenagers, and I would probably even say adults in many ways, right? That include our private parts or in general our genitalia. It could include other body parts like your mouth, your hand, etc. And these are behaviors that are just what we expect to happen as we grow and develop from infants into toddlers, young children, school-age children, preteens, etc. Like playing doctor or playing house, or the game of I'll show you mine if you show me yours, which I promise we will not be playing today on the webinar. That might get us in trouble. So these are normal behaviors. What's really important to consider about typical sexual behavior is we have to look at the role of culture. And so what's the culture of the community in which the family lives, the state, the country, the impact of religion, etc. There are many factors that come into play. So I remember growing up, I lived on the East Coast in Virginia, and I remember hearing that people in Europe tended to be naked more than what we were here in the United States. I remember as a child being very excited to hear about nude beaches in Europe. And in truth, Europeans do tend to have higher rates of nudity in children and young children. As they get older, that changes some. Here in the United States, that's different. I don't think we have any legally sanctioned nude beaches here in the United States. We might. But in Europe, that's more of an acceptable thing. And so in terms of sexual behavior that's normal, looking at one's culture to really see the context of the behavior on that spectrum. So sex play between children is just an extension of typical sexual behavior. It's often a set of behaviors that happen between children that are curious about their bodies and the environment. They may be curious about things that they have seen or heard, and they're acting out with other children in a way, again, that's developmentally normal or appropriate. These behaviors typically are not very frequent. They don't happen over long periods of time. So these are behaviors that just kind of happen on the spur of the moment, rather spontaneous in many ways. Just like when children are playing doctor, for example, one child presents to the other child who's playing the doctor and says, "My elbow hurts." The other child says, "Okay, I need to see your private part." And one child pulls down their pants. They look, they might touch, pull pants back up, and a kid slaps a Band-Aid on their arm and says, "Here, have 2 cookies and call me tomorrow." And they go on playing doctor in other ways that doesn't involve private parts. So a very simple or basic example of a behavior that's born out of curiosity. It was just part of routine play. It doesn't happen very often or over long periods of time. Sex play often is between children that know one another, so children that are comfortable or familiar. There's a sense of security there in terms of sex play with siblings, other close family members, best friends at school or daycare. Really focusing now on children. And adolescent sex play looks a little different, right? As puberty has hit, dating has started, and adolescents are moving more toward more mature types of sexuality. Sex play in children also happens between kids of similar developmental levels, since that's how children are generally aggregated by age or developmental level. It would make sense then that they would be playing together, know one another, and have that sense of security. Sex play often is not associated with any strong bothersome emotions like fear, guilt, anxiety. There may be some embarrassment along with that, but in general, sex play is seen by children as being a neutral experience, in some cases even a positive experience. So I got ahead of myself a little bit. In terms of how children look at sex play, really that's this slide here. When we look at long-term implications of sex play, and looking particularly at adults who reminisce about their childhood, what I just said holds true, that most adults are seeing their sex play as, in childhood, again, not as a negative experience. Also, what we know is that sex play in childhood doesn't really correspond to anything in adulthood. So when boys have sex play with other boys, girls with girls, or boys and girls together, it's not an indicator of their long-term adult sexual orientation or what their preferences may be in adulthood around sex with their chosen partner. It merely is a set of behaviors that happen in childhood, again, developmentally expected. So moving right on into what are problematic sexual behaviors, you might hear me say PSB, the acronym for the term. Problematic sexual behaviors are, again, behaviors that involve genitals or other body parts, like a mouth or a hand, that are potentially harmful, that could be illegal depending on your jurisdiction, and really at the core are developmentally inappropriate. These are behaviors that happen between kids, sometimes of the same age or a different, varying age ranges. This term doesn't infer anything about the origin of the behavior or the motivation. So Jane will talk in a few slides about where do these behaviors come from, what motivates kids to engage in these behaviors. This term is merely a descriptive term, problematic sexual behavior. And when we put child in the front of that, we're using people first language, and we're keeping a focus on children, not sex offenders, not perpetrators, not pedophiles. We're talking about kids that have a serious type of behavior problem that is very easily treated in mental health therapy, which we'll talk about later as well. So again, keeping the focus on kids, these are behaviors that are not okay, developmentally inappropriate, potentially harmful. So how do we determine when a sexual behavior is problematic or not? If we think back to the slide and information on what is typical sex play and sexual behavior, we start to get some understanding. So when behaviors are happening at a higher frequency, occur over a longer duration of time, involve some type of aggression, force, coercion, those are markers of problematic behavior. When the behaviors tend to be unresponsive to parental intervention, such as being grounded from seeing your friends or not being allowed to be in a room alone with another child, and a child continues to break the rules around sexual behavior, that's problematic. Also, if behaviors if they're taking children away from normal childhood activities like getting to school on time, getting to dinner on time, spending time outside with friends or family members, that's problematic. I always like to take all of this information back to how do we determine how general behaviors are problematic or not. So if a child is stealing, say, for instance, candy from a store, if they're doing it at a high frequency, they're not responding to parental intervention, etc., we would use these same criteria in many ways to determine that behavior is problematic. It's similar to looking at sexual behaviors with some caveats like level of intrusion. There are a set of sexual behaviors that are particularly rare in children, like oral genital contact or any type of penetration. So really looking at those things. Lastly, there are a couple of items that I think warrant a little more discussion. That when the sexual behavior causes a negative or adverse reaction from the other child, that certainly is a strong indication that the behavior is problematic and would warrant further assessment and possible treatment. Also thinking about the other child, the child victim, getting them into services, possibly for a trauma assessment, etc. The last item on this slide I'd like to address are when the age differences or developmental differences come into play. Children that are the same age can engage in sexual behavior that would be considered problematic. But what's the magic number? Is it 1 year age difference, 3 years age difference? And we don't have really good answers for that. Some may depend on the jurisdiction. Some comes from other factors surrounding the problematic sexual behavior. So when there is concern that age or developmental difference is at play that could be making the behavior problematic, consulting a professional to get some more information and possibly seeking professional services could be really helpful in making that determination. So in general, what are these kids and teenagers like? We know for kids and teens, there's no distinct profile for their sexual behavior problems. Different from adult sex offenders, where there's a lot of research looking at what are the characteristics of that population. We don't know as much about adolescents and children. With children, we know even less. We do know that kids and teenagers really, in many ways, are nothing like their adult counterparts. Children, even less so. There's just no connection between children with problematic sexual behavior and adult sex offenders. And the connection between adolescents and adults isn't as strong, I think, as many people would think. We do know that these kids and teens present with a variety of issues, could have other co-occurring conditions or concerns, like impulse control disorders, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder. We do see in our younger population, in our children, more children presenting with learning disabilities, language delays, and we have some ideas around that. But that's something that we see here in our program and kind of across other sites with whom we're working. We know that these kids and families come with a high level of stress. No one gets very eager to run out and tell their friends and their family and community what their children were doing sexually over the weekend with one another. So these families tend to be more isolated or withdrawn. Caregivers may have more difficulty liking their children or getting along with their children because of their own reaction. It may remind them of their own experience. Younger children tend to be more female and have more issues. Adolescents tend to almost always be male. We know that age of risk for most adolescents is going to be between the ages of 10 and 14. So that's the age range to be mindful of when kids may be more likely to engage in problematic sexual behavior about the same time as puberty. How many kids are out there with problematic sexual behavior? We don't really know. There's no one agency tracking these youth. And so it's hard to put a number on how many new cases are presenting a year and how many cases exist. For adolescents, the story is a little different. We know that about a third of all child sexual abuse is committed by adolescents, mostly boys. Again, girls just really aren't on the radar as much, but are starting to get increasing attention. I think now I'm going to pass over to Jane and have her pick up and finish us out.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jimmy. A big question folks have when you have a child who has problematic sexual behaviors, how do they develop that? So a lot of people assume that it's sexual abuse. And in the 80s, actually, when people began to recognize that children actually can have problematic sexual behavior, the assumption was sexual abuse, and the term was sexually reactive children. So assuming that a child was sexually abused and the behaviors they were showing was a direct responsible of the sexual abuse experiences. Indeed, in the mid-90s, when I began programs looking at preschool kids with sexual behavior problems, I also assumed that the origins of those behaviors was sexual abuse. And that's really why we need to look at the research and be able to examine what is going on, because what we have found is although sexual abuse is certainly one of the red flags or risk factors for problematic sexual behavior, it appears to be much more complex than a simple sexual abuse to problematic sexual behavior. So what we know is actually that there's a number of different contributors to the origins of problematic sexual behaviors. In sexual abuse, being sexually abused as a young child with multiple perpetrators, but also thinking more broadly about what are the factors that lead to a child to have problematic behavior in general. And these same factors have been related to development of problematic sexual behaviors. So having models of coercion, harsh parenting, difficulty in being able to manage high feelings well, physical abuse, domestic violence, these things have been found to be important contributors to developing a range of delinquent and problematic behaviors, including sexual behavior problems. Another important factor is what are the factors that lead to a child to making good decisions or not good decisions, learning about the rules in the world, and a lot of that is what the caregivers teach and support them. And so the slide here gives you information about supportive and protective factors that help children be able to make good decisions, even despite traumatic or difficult situations. Having parents providing guidance, support, having good communication with them, having ways to cope healthy with difficult situations. That these can help kids, even kids that have individual factors that make it more difficult, such as ADHD or learning problems. Next, we want to talk about the family response. One of the things we do know about youth with problematic sexual behavior, it's critical really to look at the entire family and the impact on them. And one of the things I think it's important to reflect as professionals working with youth with problematic sexual behaviors is, I don't know how many of you are parents, maybe you guys can put in the chat bar or whatever if you are, but if you think about your own children, and what if someone, professional or friend, came and told you your child acted out sexually with another child? What would you do? How would your response be? Quite emotional and probably quite wide-ranging, and that's exactly what we find in the families that we work with. Some of them react with initial defending their own children, denying that this could possibly happen, anger at their child for thinking about the things that they've done, or anger at other people for saying that their child had done these behaviors. There are lots of myths about these youth and our understanding of these youth. We'll talk about some of those later in the webinar. But parents come with these myths, believing there's no hope for the future for their child, not understanding the effective components of treatments and the importance of their involvement. And then we also have to take into play their own history, perhaps their own history of abuse, and how that might impact their way of understanding what has happened with their child. Kids with problematic sexual behavior mostly act out with kids they know, and that's often family members. So parents can be torn where a child has acted out on another one of their own children and feel very divided in regards to being able to support all of their children and being able to understand then the impact of the sexual behaviors on their other children, or perhaps their nieces, nephews, or other family members. What we know about the effects of youth-initiated problematic sexual behavior on the other kids is that it appears to be wide-ranging and depend on factors such as was there coercion, force, aggression used in the act of problematic sexual behavior? That would lead to more problematic reactions from the child. The age difference, severity, how were they functioning prior to those acts? And similar to other acts of trauma, the support of the parents and caregivers makes a big difference on their long-term adjustment. The effects could be confusion. What was this all about? What does this mean? They may develop problematic sexual behaviors themselves. And we've seen that where families where we have older kids have acted out on younger siblings and then they act out on younger siblings. It can even cause a traumatic reaction such as post-traumatic stress disorder. In our younger kids or preschool kids, it's not uncommon that we see separation anxiety as part of that response. They may then develop problems getting along with other kids and understanding them and other behavior problems. A big question for many of you would be, what are the treatment outcomes? What do we know that works? To be able to talk briefly about this in this webinar, there has been studies, and the themes of the results of this research done in meta-analysis, etc., is that this is a problem that treatment involving caregivers is essential. In fact, what is done with the parents have had a stronger impact on outcomes. So teaching the parents how to manage their child behaviors, how to supervise their child, how to increase appropriate behavior, good peer relationships, and how to help them make better decisions. In the adolescent group, multisystemic therapy has had the best outcomes for looking at illegal sexual behavior. This treatment not only involves the caregivers, but the community will involve neighbors and schools and in the home environment. We also know that outcomes of these treatments are very good with very low recidivism rate, including a 2% recidivism rate 10 years after treatment of school-age kids with problematic sexual behaviors. So if you want to look at the characteristics of the treatment, what you want to look at, again, what is going on with the caregivers and how to engage the caregivers in the treatment, addressing parenting, addressing being able to address sexual behavior rules and boundaries. From the beginning, having a clear safety plan to prevent future problematic and illegal behaviors. Kids' friendships are key, so them developing healthy relationships with non-delinquent peers is going to be important for their outcome. Many of the early treatments focused on treating them similar to adults with pedophilia, when in fact we find that it's a very small percentage of youth that actually have a deviant sexual arousal and require that kind of specialized protocol. So what can we do? How can we help families when they have children with problematic sexual behavior? A key part of it is to do no harm. Let's avoid treatments that are harmful messages and policies and instead implement ones that we know that will help family engagement and rehabilitation. There's a wonderful article by Dr. Mark Chaffin, Our Minds Are Made Up, Don't Confuse Us with the Facts. And this article summarizes how much of our public policy is based on fear rather than what we know. And what we know is that crime, including delinquency, is more likely to occur when the bonds to society are weakened. That instead what we need to do is really have strong anchors in the school, stable relationships in the home, pro-social relationships and committed relationships. And when our policies tear those down, we're actually potentially doing more harm than good when it comes to community protection. We've done qualitative interviews with the caregivers and panel discussions with youth, and we wanted to provide some of the themes of what they have shared of how we can better help them and serve them. The caregivers have a strong theme about what do the first people tell them, and I've labeled this as first responders. These can be law enforcement, child protective services, family members, school. Who finds out about this and how do they approach the caregivers? They said that when they feel judged, when they feel their child is judged, it negatively impacts, that they would like for folks to come and see their children as children, the problem being serious, but not to judge them, but instead give them hope that they can do things to make things better in the future, to be able to help their child make better choices. And another theme is being with other parents going through similar things have helped motivate them and provide support, because this is an issue that can cause isolation. Even people with good social support systems may have difficulty talking to those natural supporters about something so sensitive and taboo, such as their child acting out sexually. The children have said similar themes. I was really moved by their comment about don't expect me to open up about everything initially. This is really important because we have a tendency as a profession to say if a child does not tell us what's going on, they're in, quote, denial and have a lot of negative perceptions about them. Well, there's a lot of things that make it difficult for them to open up. So being able to establish the kind of trust and relationship and support to allow them to be able to openly discuss these concerns. They talked about being with their family helps them directly work on it, and that groups similar to the caregivers has helped them not feel alone and feel support. So in summary, what I would encourage all of you is when in contact with the families to be able to convey both that this is serious, but there's hope. not the doom and gloom, but instead let's think about what are the safety plans, what are the supports we need, how can we communicate with you along the way, and how can we get you to effective treatment as quickly as possible. There are some common misconceptions about these youth that we wanted to touch base on. One is, can these kids live with other children, or do all of these children need to be in a home where they're the only child? Most of the children with problematic sexual behaviors are able to live with other children, but you need to be able to make an individualized assessment. These are some of the things to consider. Do the caregivers have the parental capacity to provide the supervision and safety needs the youth has? One of the youth we've worked with, the parents were doing very well, but then ended up falling back on an old substance use issue and then lost that capacity. That child needed to not stay in that home because the parent's capacity for the supervision and safety was compromised. Can the child respond to the supervision? And then also the impact of the other children in the home. So if the child is acted out with other kids in the home, do those other kids in the home have a traumatic reaction, are scared of their brother or sister? Then that would suggest a need for separation. If instead they are able to feel safe together, feel protected, and be able to address, they're likely to be able to stay in the same home. The same kinds of things are true for school. These children have been able to be successful in the school environment and can thrive in the school environment, and being able to take an individualized assessment about their risks and strengths, as well as the school's risks and strengths, and being able to have a protective plan as needed. Many of these youth are able to be successfully treated in a community environment. The treatment outcome studies I shared earlier are community-based treatments. A few children do need residential or inpatient treatment, and that should be on a case-by-case, often looking at the other psychiatric issues of the child. And examples, we served a child who began having psychotic thoughts and self-harm thoughts, and that was not responding to outpatient care, and he needed to be transferred to an inpatient unit. These are rare circumstances, but your attention needs to be paid on what are the psychiatric issues as well as the safety issues for that child, to be able to make the decisions in regards to the level of treatment. So in regards to are we catching adult sex offenders early when we're seeing a child with problematic sexual behavior? The accumulation of evidence and research is indicating that most children, most youth with problematic sexual behavior will not grow on to become adults with illegal sexual behaviors, particularly those that are provided and responding to outpatient treatment programs. One characteristic that we see is our preschool kids with problematic sexual behavior are mostly girls. We do know adults with illegal sexual behaviors are by far mostly boys. In addition to that is, I think people think that there is this link because there are adults with illegal sexual behaviors who did start early. The population of children who have problematic sexual behavior who will become adult is a narrow group, and being able to not assume that all these children are at high risk for a long-term pattern of sexual behavior problems. We wanted to share a little bit about the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Program, where they are making efforts in communities across the country to not only establish evidence-based treatment for youth with problematic sexual behaviors, but be able to do the change, the community change, to make this an effective program to serve the youth, their child victims, and the caregivers. And so across the country, they have identified sites that are using multidisciplinary teams to look at their current policies and practices, move toward more an evidence-based practice, and provide a kind of coordinated care for the entire family once it's identified, and utilizing the information such as from the interviews with the caregivers to help feed and inform that whole process. through the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth, funded by OJJDP. We also have a website that we hope that you will be able to also go to and download some fact sheets. I noticed in the chat bar some questions about materials being available that we encourage you to go to the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth website and be able to access additional information, fact sheets, resources, book lists, and so forth. So I hope you find this information helpful. We looked at how sexual behaviors can range from typical to concerning to problematic, understanding there's not a set profile and really need to look at the family's individual circumstances, be able to engage them in effective treatment, and look at our public policies and practices so that we can be able to best identify these youth and get them into evidence-based services.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. That was wonderful, and Jimmy as well. I'm going to try putting my own webcam on, but I'm having my own connectivity issues. So if you can't see me, let me know. And also I'm on the phone because anyway, more than you need to know. Anyway, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Jane and Jimmy. And we've gotten actually some really wonderful questions in here as well. And so I want to, and you actually addressed it. One of the first one was, what kind of, can you just talk a little about the fact sheets and the resources? And so I think people really appreciate knowing how much you're really offering. And my understanding is that your website will actually continue to grow. You have a section for parents right now. There'll be some other additional sections as well. Is that right? And Jane, I want to throw that to you first. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Joan. And yes, we can see you. Yes, we're developing, and we'll have the professional side of the website up soon. So this is information designed for a wide range of professionals in juvenile justice, child welfare, schools, etc. And in addition to that, we have a framework for a youth section of the website too. So in the future, we also want to be able information directly available for youth. So they're not going to the internet, other sites for false information.
Great, that's wonderful. Thank you. One of the questions was towards the end of your talk was that if you could, that came at the beginning and the end, but can you speak to maybe the role of internet pornography and problematic sexual behaviors? And is there any evidence that came up earlier of pornography leading to problematic sexual behaviors? And Jimmy, why don't you start with that one?
Sure. To my knowledge, there isn't really any good, clear link between pornography yet and problematic sexual behavior in children. Anecdotally, from our own program and assessments I've done, I see more children now exposed to pornography, and I know that there is some research out that shows that children are more likely to be exposed to pornography now at younger ages than before. Some children, I think, can be very clear and insightful about the origin of their behavior and say that they saw something in an adult video and were curious what it might feel like. I hear that more likely with adolescents that I work with, where those boys have seen some type of pornography. There happens to be an opportunity to engage in some sexual behavior, typically with a younger family member, and they got caught, but they were really very curious. So unfortunately, no, not yet really, no very strong research on that.
Great, thank you. And Jane, at any point, if you want to jump in, also just ask one or the other of you, but please feel free to jump in if you'd like to add to your questions at all. And I know that that one of the things that people talk, another question was asking about, so the language that you had talked about, language of expressive therapy, and I was wondering, or expressive language, sorry, if you could just talk a little bit about what you meant by expressive language and working with these kids. And Jane, you want to try that one?
I'm not
Jane.
talking about language difficulties, or I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, you had talked about using expressive language and working with these. So that the specific question, let's see, where is it? Can you speak more about the role of? Sorry, no. Of course, now I can't find it. This has not been my day of. But talking about expressive language.
I think it may be able to clarify. So we talked about co-occurring concerns in children with problematic sexual behavior and children that present with learning disabilities or language delays. And I'll pass that back to Jane.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So the way that I like to conceptualize it is that there are individual vulnerabilities to risk factors that make it more difficult to cope and understand and have healthy responses to things. And so one way of thinking about it is that when we have confusing or perhaps even traumatic situations, a healthy way of coping is being able to talk about it, to put it into words and language, get support from others. But if that ability is compromised, if I have problems putting these weird feelings insides and curiosity into words, and I instead act out on those, I can act out in a variety of problematic ways. And so it's been found to be a risk factor. So if we look in our preschool kids, they tend to have lower scores in their verbal abilities than average. And in part is representing some difficulties managing some things and expressing it in ways that are unhealthy.
Great, thank you. You also mentioned, throughout your talk, you're talking a lot about engaging parents. And one of the questions was if you're working with children or adolescents in a residential program and there aren't parents there, what's the best role? How do you best engage the caseworkers and the treatment providers in that case as well? So maybe since Jimmy helped me with that one, maybe I'll throw this back to you again, Jimmy.
Sure. Engaging parents and caregivers is critical to any type of mental health therapy, I believe, with children or adolescents. And when kids present from a residential or inpatient facility and there's no clear identified caregiver, we often work to identify who on the unit or in the hospital or the facility could kind of take the more direct role with that child and participate in treatment around that. In terms of trying to engage their caregivers when children are out of the community, there's a lot of work with whomever has governed the child being out of the community. So if that's Child Protective Services, juvenile justice, etc., but really trying to liaise with the family to get them involved. I think one strategy that we use often is talking about the transition back home, and that when kids are going to reenter the community back into their placement, having caregivers on board to have all of the resources and skills and strategies that they need to make that a successful transition. So in treatment, the focus is working with caregivers on how to enhance their parenting strategies already to manage their child's specific problematic sexual behaviors. And often we can find a way to get them engaged, if not in the beginning of treatment when children are first in a secure facility, but maybe toward halfway or toward the end to talk about transition to get them involved so that's smooth. Jane, do you have anything to add?
I was going to say more and more residential and inpatient units are taking advantage of being able to serve families through web-based kinds of things and be able to provide the kind of education Jimmy's saying so that they are more prepared and stay connected with their child. Programs that fail to connect those caregivers with the youth or in residential care, what happens is the family gets disconnected. And so they're less likely to want to have their child back in their home, and it makes the transition back home more difficult and unfortunately increases the likelihood that we raise these children in care rather than with their families.
Thank you. And there's a number of people who've said how great your fact sheets and resources are, so just wanted to highlight that you already have a fan club here in the audience. I think, Jane, you talked a little bit about some harmful treatment and particularly harmful policies. I think when you were talking about the Mark Chafin article. I'm wondering if you could maybe, someone asked for some examples of what you mean by either harmful treatment or harmful policies.
Great question. So across the country, unfortunately, a lot of time, models of treatment that are designed for adults are being used with children and even very young children. And so the goals of those treatments are designed to address dysfunctional arousal systems. And we have no evidence that is a reason or motivation of that problematic sexual behavior of youth. So, for example, I was asked to consult on a case of a 12-year-old who was receiving arousal reconditioning therapy, which involved him smelling ammonia paired with pictures of intimacy. And again, designed for adults with pedophilia, but inappropriately placed with a 12-year-old with no deviant sexual arousal. And so really being able to think the purpose of treatments and doing what's developmentally appropriate for the youth. The other, I think, broader thing, probably more common, is that most communities don't have a clear way to identify and serve these youth, and so they fall through the cracks. So across the country, these children are commonly ignored early on. This is kids being kids, not understanding it truly is problematic and potentially harmful, until they get older, and then they get sent away to residential care. When instead, if we had policies that help us understand this is a serious behavioral health issue, and work together as agencies to support the family to get evidence-based treatments. So in some communities, Child Protective Services are reluctant to get involved because it is a child-initiated behavior. Law enforcement, understandably, don't want to be involved with the young kids, but then nobody is, and it's unclear how to get the families the help they need.
Great, thank you. One of the following up just on that, one of the very specific questions was, are you familiar with door alarms on bedrooms to help with supervisors or parents, really, and is it effective? And just whether it's maybe that specific question, but also just maybe more generally, what tools you have found to be effective tools to bring into either home or residential programs. And on to Jimmy.
Sure. Yes, our program regularly talks to caregivers about the use of different types of tools to help monitor and supervise their children. Of course, really good supervision is going to be key to helping these kids not go on to have additional problematic sexual behavior. But ultimately, caregivers have got to have a break. You've got to use the bathroom. There are other things to do. What happens at night when everyone's asleep? And you're worried that your child may get up and wander into someone else's bedroom. So we talk to families about a variety of things, the use of two-way radios or baby monitors, alarms on the doors, also getting a little bit more creative in terms of just how the space is designed. So if children are having to share a bedroom because of the families in a smaller home, the use of bookcases to separate the space between the beds or hanging sheets from the ceiling may be another way that families can help give some privacy to the children sharing a bedroom. So it's just a matter of brainstorming. And that's one reason that we really like the use of group therapy in this approach, because other parents have other great ideas on how to manage supervising their kids when resources are limited or when logistics are just problematic. It's the same with people, caregivers in facilities where children may be placed, helping them to problem solve how kids would have time away from grown-ups, so there can be a clear supervision plan, clear ways to monitor that child if a direct line of sight is not possible.
Great. Jane, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
I would echo what Jimmy said and think about two things. One is the family's individual strengths and needs, and design the plan, as Jimmy said, that fits that family's. Some families would work really well with the door alarms, and some need other kinds of supports. And then I love what you said about the importance of group. I think if we just tell parents, you need to supervise your kids 100% time, and they feel that pressure, they'll say they're doing it, but it's not a reality because it's very challenging. But to instead say, you need to supervise, it is difficult, what's your most difficult moment, how can we help you? Then you get reality of their home situation and the supports they need.
Right. And a question just came in about, could you maybe talk about the situations where the parents may be minimizing the behavior? So you have a safety plan in place, but the parents may not be fully engaged in understanding the severity of what's going on as the child returns or adolescent returns to their home. And Jimmy, you want to take that one?
Sure. Jane talked earlier on a slide, just in terms of a parent's reaction to their child and their behavior. And when parents are challenged to see the seriousness of their behavior, and that could be for multiple reasons, their own trauma history, just absolute disbelief that their son or daughter could engage in this kind of behavior, et cetera. Really, I think a great approach to those caregivers is spending some one-on-one time in session with them, some conversation, to really look at what's behind that. I think most parents really are coming just from a place of complete shock or disbelief, and having some really strong, bothersome feelings that they can't quite work out on their own. So it may be more difficult for them to accept or acknowledge if their child engaged in these behaviors. I think with some parents, it also brings up what other people will think of them. And I know that I think a lot of people would say that's not, why would that be important? But ultimately, when a caregiver thinks that people would look at them and say, gosh, this could be your fault because you weren't a good enough parent, it may make them more likely to not fully acknowledge, again, the seriousness of the situation and tend to minimize a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know certainly I've talked to parents where they say, remember one mama said it was would be easier to say her son was a murderer than to say he had sexually abused a younger child. So that does make a whole lot of sense in that context. Jane, one question for you that came up is that I think you talked about the importance of treatment, obviously, and what one person asked if there's any research around recidivism rates for children with treatment versus no treatment, and I think maybe to separate that out, both children and adolescents, either way.
It's a great question, and this is the core reason why treatment outcome for this population can be so challenging. It is the ethical dilemma you would be put to have half the kids go to a no treatment control and half get a treatment that you believe is effective. And so, to my knowledge, the research that has been done has compared active treatments instead. And that makes it more challenging because you have to have more youth in the research to be able to demonstrate a greater effect of one active treatment over another.
Thank you. So I think we're actually at the end of our hour anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're at the end of the hour here. So I want to just really take a moment to just finish up our slides here. And Greg, if you can put this back to my slides. And what I'd like to do is just thank everybody for being a part of this today. And in particular, I just want to just like to say that the next NERI Press webinar is going to be on December 15th, and it's about promoting sex-wise parenting, and that's going to be by Jane Rosenzweig. So I think that'll be a very exciting webinar as well. And I want to just also take a moment to thank the sponsors of our series. As I mentioned, that we really have not had. This would not be possible if we didn't have our sponsors. And I want to thank our sponsors, which is the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the Crime Prevention Branch, the Family Life Counseling, Psychiatric Services, Gerena Associates, Houston Transitions to Wellness, Leo Hoffman Center, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, Morrison Child and Family Services, New Hope Treatment Centers, the St. Mary Home for Children, Yarok Counseling, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we would love if you would become a sponsor. That's the only way that we can run these series. And it's $98 for individuals or $250 for organizations, where you can have up to 10 people join. You're guaranteed a seat at every webinar. So if we sell out, you still get you get access to CE credits, and you also get 2 free NERI Press books. We feel like this is a real win-win situation for everybody. And finally, I just want to say thank you. Thank you certainly to Jane and to Jimmy for sharing such valuable information. It really was enlightening for me, and I've been working in this field for many years. And also, just I hope it's helpful to the audience. Again, please, for everybody, when you finish, please close out so we can send you the evaluation, so we can also give Jimmy and Jane some feedback. So thank you again, Jane. Thank you again, Jimmy. This was a great webinar.